Hello, welcome back to another limited release coffee tasting. This time I wanted to share the first release of 2025, which is from Standout Coffee. This is the Anoxic Washed SL28, a very interesting coffee. If you want to read more details about it, check out the link in the description. But what I wanted to do today with our limited release tasting is talk a little bit about RPM differences in recipes. So for those of you brewing on xBloom Studio, if you dig into the recipes, you will find out that you can adjust RPM of the grinder. Here we go, we have our machine. If I go into here, wake it up, you'll find that you can adjust RPM. Our grinder goes from 60 RPM up to 120 RPM. And I'm going to give you guys a high-level overview of this, but if you picked up this coffee, what we're going to do is we're going to brew 2 cups, one at 120 RPM and one at 60 RPM. So get 2 crafts and get 2 of these guys ready. So RPM is a very, very complex subject. I'm going to keep it very simple. If you are interested in a more deep dive video, we can do that at a later date. But I wanted to just talk a bit about impact on the cup, at least what we have observed and what a lot of you guys in the community have observed, as well as, well, how does it change brewing? What exactly happens in the cup? So the simplest way I can explain to you the 2 differences between low RPM on this grinder, which is 60 RPM, and high RPM, which is 120 RPM, is a drastic shift in dynamics. So I'll start with 60 RPM since we talked about that first. 60 RPM, first of all, 60 RPM gives us, I would say, the clearest presentation of coffee that you can get out of this grinder. You'll find that a lot of those flavor notes will be very defined and also harmonious and tied together. So you'll be able to kind of pinpoint, is this a red fruit? Okay, well, what kind of red fruit is it? And you'll see a lot of those more nuanced details of the coffee. Whereas if you run this grinder at 120 RPM, you'll find it to be significantly more acidity forward, a more dynamic cup, I would say. So you'll have a lot of those dynamics, you'll have the acidity kind of boosted in certain areas, but you will lose out on some of those little nuance complexity, say that definition between one flavor note to another if you were running it at, say, 60 RPM versus 120 RPM. So the simplest way is if you want a more interesting cup, run it at 120 RPM. If you want a more nuanced and defined cup, run it at 60 RPM. But we have had feedback, and also personally, I do think some of the cups at 60 RPM can be perceived to be maybe a little boring or maybe a little sterile. I'm in the camp of I'm willing to sacrifice that super clear definition of flavor, of acidity, for a more interesting tasting cup. So I actually really like to run this grinder at 120 RPM. But of course, you can experiment. Maybe the cup that you're looking for is going to be 80 RPM or 90 RPM. I also want to mention that if you are running the grinder at 60 RPM, you will find that you can grind very fine. You can grind actually a few clicks finer, so compared to 120 RPM. So say you were trying to match the brew times between the two, you actually can go, usually depending on coffee, I can go about 3 to 5 steps finer to match the same brew time as the 120 RPM. So that's another thing to experiment with because coffee is also handled differently with total brew time. For this video, we are going to use the exact same recipe. We're only going to change the RPM. So without further ado, let's go ahead and brew this coffee. This is actually an incredible, incredible coffee. Super expressive, probably one of the sweetest coffees we have featured on xBloom. And we get flavor notes of orange blossom, peach, sweet citrus, molasses. You'll find so much lovely sweetness that just lingers on your palate with this coffee. And of course, this is from Standout, coming out of Stockholm, Sweden. Lovely European roaster. So here we go. Again, let's get 2 of these and let's get this all set up. So of course you can scan the recipe on here, or what we can do is we can look at it on our phone. I'm actually just going to pull this up on the phones. Edit the recipe, run it first at 60 RPM, then run it at 120 RPM. So we're gonna do the 60 RPM version first. So I'm just going to lower this all the way down to 60 RPM. And I am going to now take this coffee and brew. This is a fun coffee. It is still a wash coffee, but it definitely is very expressive. So you'll kind of see what I'm talking about as I'm tasting. But I think it's super fun to take the same coffee and brew with various recipes, especially on Studio. You'll also hear that the grinder is a little bit quieter. It does take a bit longer running it at 60 RPM than 120 RPM. Also, visually speaking, it might be really hard to see, especially if you're brewing and you're looking at the angle I am, but at 60 RPM you will observe visually a little bit less fines than 120 RPM. Wow, that coffee smells really, really nice. I get a lot of this nice citrus. You know, they say orange blossom. That's what I'm smelling. There's florality in this as well, but more so, I just really, really enjoy what this coffee tastes like. I mean, it is so sweet and expressive in that regard. Then we brew the second one, same recipe, but adjusted RPM. All right, so that is our final pour. For those of you wondering, if you're brewing this coffee, there's a really, really long, a lot of liquid that's added for the third pour, so it will get split up because of the overflow protection. So our first cup here, and wow, this is this is a great coffee. I know I'm supposed to be talking about what are the differences, but great coffee. So that is also one thing to do, is pick an expressive coffee if you want to taste the differences. This is a great coffee for that. So now we do the exact same thing, run this guy at 120 RPM. And this is what you might be used to hearing. Grinder's a little bit louder, it's gonna grind a lot faster. But let's give this a taste. Oh, it smells amazing. This, again, this is one of the sweetest coffees we have featured. And smelling it, it smells like peach. I get a little bit of that orange blossom. Even at 60 RPM, I get a lot of expressive flavors. Right? I'm not saying 60 RPM is boring. I'm saying 60 RPM is a very different presentation to 120, which we'll taste when this finishes. But at 60 RPM, I mean, first of all, let me just talk about the coffee. Like, if you want to experience what is the coffee supposed to taste like? Well, what is it doing? What does your recipe do, right? 60 RPM is a great way to experiment with that, which is, let's just let the coffee kind of shine. Like, what does the coffee taste like, right? In this case, I'm getting so much lovely peach. I get sugar. It's like just coating my tongue. Long, lasting finish on the palate here. Once it cools, we get a lot more of that acidity popping up, but the flavors are very harmonious. Like, I would say this is incredibly balanced of a cup. You can taste all the nuances of flavor notes, right? Like, this is what's interesting about coffees like this, where it's expressive in its own way, and you're able to experience like all the little nuances. So in this case, okay, I'm getting this peach, I'm getting citrus, I'm getting this like honey or sugar that's on my palate, right? I'm able to kind of taste that they're all individually there and how they are interlinked together. But I would say the profile is very balanced and sweet. So this is what I'm tasting. If I use my hands, I'm like, it's just linear. It's very linear tasting. It's like, here is 1, 2, and 3. Of course, as the coffee cools, we'll see maybe peaks of acidity, but we aren't tasting, I'm not really tasting anything here that is like, there's some sort of thing that's imparting flavor on this. This here, 120 RPM, wrapped up. So now we have the same coffee, one at 120 RPM and one at 60 RPM. What are the differences? Let's begin tasting. So this is 120 RPM, by the way. At 120 RPM, the first thing that I experience is this citrus acidity. It's like very upfront, it's dynamic, it's in your face, it's on your palate, and then the rest of the cup is nice and sweet. But the main thing I'm experiencing here is citrus acidity versus 60 RPM. 60 RPM has a much softer presentation of acidity. So instead of it being like this loud acidity that I'm experiencing, this is a much softer presentation, more tea-like, in fact. And it is very balanced. This cup is actually a little more unbalanced, where I'm like, this acidity is peaking. It's very interesting to taste, and I understand it's citrus acidity, but this here, it's a little more tied together. Like, there's harmony in here. I can tell there are very nuanced aspects of this acidity. There is, of course, peach in here, but what I'm experiencing is at 60 RPM, I'm experiencing this citrus acidity tied together to peach, then tied to the sweetness. So I'm experiencing kind of three big components of this coffee, and I'm experiencing how they're tied together, and I'm experiencing the individual components. And then the overall profile of this is very balanced, sweet, tea-like, high clarity, as we would say. When the coffee's cold, you get that acidity that's punching through, but the overall style is very balanced. Whereas at 120 RPM, much more acidity forward, but I don't get as much peach in this. I actually get a lot more citrus acidity that's really shifted up, way less tea-like. It is still, tea-like because it's light roast, right? But it is much more dynamic, acidity forward. It is blendier though. So I don't get that searingly clear effect. So in this case, the biggest difference is I'm not experiencing as much peach in this. However, personally, I think this is much more interesting to drink. This has that loudness that one may expect when drinking a coffee like this, but this is more nuanced, where it's like, well, here are those little fine details in the cup. So there's really a difference between a very balanced and high clarity profile that's, sweet and tame. And in some regards, it's a little sterile, it's a little boring, but that might be what you're looking for if you want to experience all of those nuanced flavor notes of some of these more interesting coffees. Whereas this is a manipulation of, I would say, the dynamics. Like the 120 RPM is for sure boosting up acidity. It's for sure making the cup more interesting, but I'm losing out on some of those really small nuanced aspects of the coffee. So yeah, that's the high-level difference between 120 RPM and 60 RPM. Feel free to experiment, especially with this coffee. I think this is a great example of tasting very big differences between RPMs. But please keep in mind, like, you can spend a lot of time playing around with all the different variables. If you have great coffee, it's going to taste good at any of these RPMs. So that's all I wanted to share today. Thank you so much for spending the time to watch this video. If you picked up this release, let me know if you enjoyed it. But otherwise, thank you so much. We have so many more interesting coffees coming this year, and I'll see you in the next one.